Thank you very much, Ms. Farhat. Thank you all for coming virtually or digitally, I don't know, Zoomly. Many a time, as I have said in the audience, and Roma has introduced our speaker, they have invariably thanked her and Franco for their impeccable hospitality and their attention to details. So this time, I was the receiving end of both of these, and I thank them immensely for their efficiency and attention to every detail. My talk is something between a book talk and a talk about Saadi and humanism. In a book talk, one would give a synopsis of the book and then maybe read passages and then open it to question and answer. But the book is in Persian. And I suspect if I do read it, some of you might not understand the Persian version yet. Hopefully you'll take classes at Stanford or other places. So this combination is going to be what I'm going to try to do. Give you a sense of what the book is about and give you a sense of why I think the subject is important. If this was ironically, late 19th century, for example, and we were at Stanford in the East Coast somewhere, or the Stanford of the East Coast somewhere, Saadi would be much better known to many Americans in this audience. Iranians, I think then and now, probably equally would have been familiar with who Saadi is because he is a giant in Iranian letters, is a giant in Iranian culture. But in 19th century, late 19th century, he was also deemed to be a giant in world history. Before world history was a concept, Goethe talked about him as one of the icons of world history. Emerson talked of him as being someone as wise as the Bible, although Emerson had read little of him and had read it in translation, and translating Saadi is very, very difficult, but they would have been familiar with it. Today, of Persian poets, Rumi, for example, or Attar, for example, I think are much more familiar in the Western world than Saadi, and I think that's a great loss. Because with no hyperbole, my colleague and I have made the argument that Saadi is no less than Shakespeare in terms of his wisdom, in terms of the depth of his understanding of the human condition, in terms of the pluralities of forms and genres that he uses to describe this human condition. And it is our hope in this book to reimagine this aspect of Saadi and humanism. And I will try to describe why I think this aspect of Saadi is particularly important. I wrote an essay on Saadi some 20 years ago. It was Saadi on Politics. That essay is included in this new collection, but the rest of the collection is the work of my dear colleague, Professor Mirzadeh, and myself. Saadi lived in Shiraz, Iran. Shiraz, a place that at that time and all the way to late 19th century was a center for growing grapes and great wines. The Shiraz wine is an absolute gift of that city to the world. But Shiraz was also a center of learning, a center of poetry. Saadi spent much of his life traveling. He was not someone who would stay in one place. Spent almost 30 years traveling and traveled much around the world. There are some controversies about whether every place that he has written about he has actually traveled to, but he has virtually traveled the entire Central Asia, India, parts of China, North Africa, and everywhere he writes, people knew of him. So Saadi is a very self-assured writer. It has what Hans Blumenberg in his magnificent book on modernity called Self-Assertive Individualism. Saadi is very self-assertive in describing his own importance and in his own greatness. He's never hyperbolic, he is never bombastic, but he's also never falsely humble. Nietzsche, I think, said it very well, that false humility is the greatest sign of arrogance, and you cannot accuse Saadi of arrogance. He knows exactly what his value, the value of his work is, and he goes out of his way to describe it. And one of the complexities of trying to write about Saadi, particularly if you're trying to cover the entire opus, is that he was very prolific, and he was very prolific in several different genres. He is easily considered one of the greatest prose writers of Persian history. He is easily considered one of the greatest poets. There are critics, and I'll tell you some about them, a little bit about them, who have dismissed his poetry, but we think for very wrong reasons. He's one of the great satirists. His satire was so daring in 13th century that in 20th century Iran, when they collected his work, they did not dare publish him. Some of his work of satire is still not included in the collected works. Some of them are included, but they have been bleeped out because they think that he is so ribald, he is so open, talking about many things, making fun of many people, and making fun of falsely pious people is one of his favorite pastimes. Praising wine also is one of his favorite pastimes. And I can tell you with some certainty that the wine he praises ain't the wine spiritual that some of the religious folks would like to attribute. He actually praises wine and is very well informed about some of its values. Now, we are going to be here talking about his humanism. And our argument in the book is that Saadi is truly a humanist long before humanism became a catchword in the West. In other words, if you read different people who have written about modernity, from Ernest Cassirer to Greenblatt to Isaiah Berlin, humanism is said to be one of the centerpieces of modernity. And I think it is. We think it is. Modernity without humanism really doesn't make sense. But at least 200 years before this becomes a catchphrase in the West and becomes a central concept in modernity and becomes a defining characteristic of a new paradigm of modernity that changes everything about how we look at ourselves, how we look at the world, how we look at religion, how we look at nature, how we look at knowledge. Saadi had many, many of those characteristics that we would identify as quintessentially humanist. Saadi is also remarkable in the role that he has had in preserving and fine-tuning the Persian language. This is someone who wrote 800 years ago. This is someone who wrote before Chaucer. Read a little bit of Chaucerian English now and read Saadi, and you see the difference. Saadi is as contemporary, as understandable, as sublimely beautiful, as sublimely simple as any modern writer. Saadi, I think, rightfully must be accredited to having a role equal to Shahnameh. Shahnameh is a great epic of Persian poetry. It is 1,000 years old. Almost everyone accepts that Persian language as a bastion of Persian identity, Iranian identity, as a bastion of identity different from the Arab identity that came to Iran through the Islamic conquest. Saadi, we say, helped preserve that. But I think no less important, and in some ways, as some linguists have argued, even more important is the role that Saadi played. The multiplicities of his discourse, not just his ability to write poetry, to write epic poetry, to write love poetry, but to write prose in a brilliant, succinct, parsimonious, precise manner, in the way we would expect of a humanist to write. One of the characteristics of humanism in the West was the rise of people who began to write in the language of everyday people. One of the traditions of humanism in painting was a tradition of painting common folks rather than the aristocracy, using the image as the writer used the language close to the language of people, language close to the language of everyday. People tell us that novels begin in the West when the vernacular, when the conversation, the talk of everyday people, when the foul language of some people in the streets enters into literature and is accepted for its literary value. All of these you find in Saadi, and you find them in a remarkable, successful way. The irony of it all is that much of the Iranian modernists, many of the advocates of Iranian humanism, have really overlooked Saadi. They have overlooked Saadi by accusing him of being things that we think he is not, being things that we actually think he is the opposite of. The idea of eclectically reading a little bit of Saadi and finding something that you find supporting your thesis that, for example, Saadi is advocating clerical power in Iran. There are people who actually have written a book in Iran, several books actually, who claim Saadi was an advocate of the Iranian regime, Vilayat Faqih, the rule of the Jewish Council. Now, Saadi is a Sunni. Saadi has nothing in common with the current form of government in Iran. He doesn't have the secular connection to it, and he absolutely doesn't have the foundational connection to it. Saadi is vigorously against the idea of mixing religion and politics. Saadi is very keen on saying that if you want happiness, you have to allow the spiritual domain to be controlled and not dominated, controlled, advised by religious ideas, and the political domain to be dominated by the political. He is fiercely against the idea of one people, one faith, one group, claiming to have an absolute monopoly of virtue and forcing that virtue on other people. He tells a brilliant story that is very relevant to Iran today. And it shows how unlike Iran today, Saadi taught. He describes how he was with his father, and his father was a pious man. We know his father was a very pious, and they were in a room, and most people had slept and were not getting up to say their prayer. And Saadi turns around, the young Saadi turns around to his father and says, "What kind of Muslims are these? Why don't they get up and say their prayer?" And the father says, "You would have done yourself a very positive step in life if you had slept and not badmouth these people. Heaven and hell is their responsibility. You don't bear responsibility for them. Don't interfere in people's lives." The idea that somebody can take claim and absolutely dominate others by their faith, whether the faith is Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Saadi is very much against that. It is remarkable how tolerant he is towards the plurality of language, how curious the plurality of religion, how curious he is about other religions. There are occasional signs of, unfortunately, anti-Semitism in some of the stories that he tells, but more often he is of the opinion that no one has a monopoly of virtue. No one can actually dictate virtue to others. He suggests the humility that is one of the defining characteristics, I think, and we think, of humanism. Humanism begins with the idea that humans are the subject and the object of history. That means humans are the most important part of the story of life. We are in this earth because we are humans, and the earth is here because we must find a way to live in it and with it. You can find truly remarkable lines in Saadi that seem to indicate that he is aware that humans don't always take care of the earth, that they must live with and live in. And it is through our cognition, through our critical, constant, rational cognition that we understand the human condition. Saadi says we are a human being, we are an animal human by the fact that we talk. But we are a human by the fact that we talk and think. And we are a correct acting human. We are different than the animals if we think critically and act accordingly, act prudently. Saadi is very much in the Aristotelian tradition of prudence, of avoiding extremes. He's constantly suggesting that those who suggest these extremes don't have a virtue to offer. They are false, they are hypocritical. And almost everything that he touches. And in our book, we discuss Saadi's views on religion, Saadi's views on beauty, Saadi's views on love, Saadi's views on politics, Saadi's views on ancient Iran. These are some of the chapters in the book. And in each of these, you find that humanism, the humanism that says the measure of things are humans. Saadi remarkably says, all that I learned about ethics, all that I learned about virtue, I learned from human beings. I think if somebody says this in Iran today, they might not survive the wrath of the judiciary, because in Iran today, positing that all virtue comes from outside and that we humans have no role in all of this is part of the dogma. Saadi is very adamant that he learned all from other human beings, and that other human beings, in spite of their difference, in spite of their skin color, in spite of their gender, in spite of their faith, are equals. They are humans. They must have a share, and their pain is our pain. The phrase that has been often repeated about him that says we are all part of the same timber of humanity, is a central part, I think, of his thinking, a central part of his poetry, a central part of his prose, and very much intended to bring both humility and curiosity. He is very much an advocate of absolute curiosity and about the need to change our views. This is part of what humanism is about. Humanism begins to tell us that as subjects and as objects, as thinkers and the subject of thought, we change. The world around us change. Our level of maturity changes. The more we think about the world, the more we see of the world, the more we are likely to have different views of the world. Saadi repeatedly talks about how all of his wisdom came from his 30 years of travel, and that how this wisdom taught him that what he taught 30 years ago has now changed into something different. And the acceptance of this difference is at the same time, in him at least, the acceptance of a humility, the acceptance of the need to listen to, observe, and coexist with others. At the same time, in terms of issues of love, for example, issues of beauty, for example, again, you see this humanism at the core of his writing. People write about humanism as the age when love becomes legitimate, not just love the divine or love of the divine, but love of two human beings for each other. Love that is not determined by power, love that is not determined by family, love that is not coerced. Saadi is remarkable in how 800 years ago talks about how if there is power relationship in a relationship, love cannot survive. Love requires equality and requires equality of sexes. Saadi, 800 years ago, has a story that always reminds me, several stories that always reminds me of Madame Bovary. Where Madame Bovary, as a masterpiece of 19th century literature, posits a different view of how we judge adultery. In Madame Bovary, the story gives us her view of the world. It isn't just the male-dominated view of the world that blames adultery, what we call pejoratively adultery, what we call morally pejoratively adultery, on a woman. Saadi says 800 years ago that if a woman is unhappy in a relationship, the man in that relationship is as responsible as the woman. Saadi is rightfully criticized for some of his misogynist lines. Saadi has some embarrassingly misogynist lines. But Saadi also has some remarkable lines praising women, not praising women for the traditional male shaped views of women, that women are kind, women are beautiful, women are good mothers. Saadi praises them for their wisdom. Saadi praises them for their prudence. In a story, Saadi places a woman's wisdom not on par, just on par with the Prophet of Islam, but puts it one step beyond. She has more patience for diversity than the Prophet of Islam has. Dukhtar Hatam Ta'i. Saadi is one of the few poets in Iranian history that has praised women, that has essentially eulogized women, but he has eulogized women for exactly their human and humanitarian and equal to men virtues, not the kind of virtues that we tend to expect from a kind of a male-centered view. Saadi's view on love are also remarkable because, as I said, he often repeats that in love, there cannot be class differentiation. There cannot be hegemony. There needs to be equality. There needs to be understanding. One of the problematic aspects of Saadi's humanism, something that has been talked about by a lot of people, and this is not unique to Saadi, but Saadi is certainly more cited for it. It is the notion that Saadi praised young boys, that Saadi was, according to some, a pederast. There is no doubt that there are lines in Saadi in praise of the young beloved that in today's world, by today's standard, would get him in a lot of hard trouble. But what we say in our narrative is that while we should expose these lines, while we should say that this kind of an attitude is problematic, we should also consider how it might well be that what he meant was in the same spirit that Plato meant when he talked in Symposium about the beloved, the only true beloved being a young boy. In other words, was he trying to be explaining a platonic love or love in that tradition, the pure perfection, or was he actually talking about this? But we must be critical of him. But we also say that in criticizing Saadi, we must use the same measures that we use in judging others. One of the most remarkable things about Saadi is how many of Iranian literature's modernists have been against Saadi. They have accused him of everything from misogyny to being a petty bourgeois, of being a praiser of kings, to be a greedy, to be a hypocrite, to be a bad poet. Nima, who should know better, says Saadi's love poetry is pedantic. It's really, it doesn't matter much. Khoei says Saadi isn't even a poet. He plays with words. Others have said Saadi is a jumble of ideas. He doesn't have much to say about the world. Whatever has come to him, whatever aphorism has come to him, he has collected and put in this kashkur, for example. But there is a consistency of thought in Saadi that we think, if one looks at critically, not submissively, not hyperbolically, not just praising him for his greatness, criticizing him where he must be, but also realizing that he is a giant. He is a giant not just in the aesthetic power of his stories and his prose and his poetry, but also the prudence, the wisdom that he brings, the toleration that he brings, his aversion to false piety, his aversion to those who want to rule in the name of false piety. Saadi has a lot of remarkable stories, critical of those who do injustice in the name of delivering religious justice. One of the more remarkable things is his consistency in saying that those who come to this world, come to politics with these kinds of certainties, with these kinds of arrogances, they're not the ones who we should follow. The ones we should follow, he says, are ourselves. More often than not, Saadi invites us to make judgment. One of the great defining characteristics of humanism is aversion to absolute delivered sermons. It is an aversion to the notion that only revealed truth in one book holds the key to all questions. It is an aversion to thinking that only I, whoever that I is, whether it's the church, whether it's the priest, whether it's the king, whether it's the philosopher, king, hold the key to heaven and salvation in this world. Humanism essentially accepts the ambiguity in the human condition, accepts the notion that none of us can arrive at the final truth. It accepts the notion that through dialogue, not through monologue, not through sermons, not through false certitudes, not through false pieties, can we arrive at happiness. Happiness is the recognition of the complexities of the world. Happiness is the recognition that we must be humble to accept that sometimes we can never arrive at a final solution. The search in a humble disposition is what his humanism is all about. Dialogue is central to Saadi. And from dialogue, you get democracy. From dialogue, you get the novel. We use the writings of Bakhtin, for example, who is considered one of the best theorists of the novel, the history of the novel. And one of the things Bakhtin posits, is that the novel emerges as a form with modernity, with humanism. In fact, he says the novel is the quintessence of humanism. The novel is the acceptance that every human being, even a criminal who goes and kills two older women to think whether he can kill them, is worthy of a narrative. Everyone has a narrative, and that narrative must be heard, can be heard. There's a complexity in the novel. There is the laughter at the world in the novel. Novel gets us to think about the world. That's why he says, rightly, I think, and Kundera later repeats this, that's why despotism, that's why authoritarian regimes, that's why totalitarian regimes hate the novel, because the novel does not accept absolutes. The novel constantly deconstructs, criticizes, shows us the gray zones of life, ideologies, pieties, certainties. Medieval world was based on accepted dualities of good and evil. The body is evil, the spirit is good. The heavens are perfection, the earthly is polluted. The saints are perfection, we are sinners. The bad guy in the fairy tale is the embodiment of all evil, and the fairy is the embodiment of all good. In the novel, we have no such thing. And Saadi is full of characteristics, characters who are novelistic. He himself, as the most important of these characters, these novelistic characters, much of the language that Saadi offers us, much of the story structure that Saadi offers us, are tools that I think in Persian language can be used and has been used by novelists and by story writers, by playwrights, by filmmakers, from Ibrahim Golestan, one of the best filmmakers, to Bahram Beyzai, who was the best playwright we have, to Golshiri. Many of these people who have tried to use the techniques, the language, the tropes of Saadi in developing their tricks, in developing their tropes, in developing their forms. I say all of this because this has a relevance, both the issue of humanism, the issue of where modernism can come in art, where democracy can come in politics, because all of these are interrelated to the problematic facing Iran over the last 150 years. And that's the question of modernity. Is modernity, and modernity means humanism, modernity means democracy, modernity means a novel that has the right to laugh at everybody, including prophets. Modernity means the novel that can laugh at a leader, can laugh at ourselves. Modernity is a poetry that can talk about sex and not worry about being executed. Modernity means a kind of a satire that can make fun of anybody and anything without thinking that there's going to be a fatwa on your head or a church edict on the door. In all of these, in the last 150 years, there have been two tendencies in Iran. One tendency has been advocated by the clergy, mostly, not all the clergy, but most of the clergy, who have said humanism, Renaissance, modernity, equal right for women, for example, pluralism of ideas, all of these are part of the Western tradition. They're the tricks, Mr. Khamenei says, taking his cue from Sayyid Qutb in Egypt. He says, these are the tricks of the Crusaders. They want to undermine our belief in Islam. We don't want modernity because it doesn't fit our culture. Another group, in my view, in our view, equally wrong, have been those who have said, Iran is a backward country. Iran has a backward culture. There might have been something in the past, way past, but forget about that. You can't hang your head on that. You need to become Western. You need to emulate them. If you want theater, go read Chekhov. If you want modern stream of consciousness, go read Proust. You have that tendency, which is the absolute other side of this other tendency, that doesn't accept that modernity is not Western, humanism is not Western. Just a few months ago, the head of Iran's judiciary, who's now off the job, and someone unfortunately worse has gotten the job, who said our error was to accept humanism. Humanism is a Western trick. Our research, I think, shows convincingly, and I have written other things in Persian and in English that tries to cover other aspects of this, that these are false dualities. These are both Eurocentric. Even the most anti-Western clergy are actually Eurocentric. They repeat the narrative of the West. This these other intellectuals who say that we must change everything. There is nothing in us that can save us. There is nothing in us from which we can learn democracy. If you want to learn democracy, go read John Locke. No, we want to learn democracy, we must read John Locke, but we must also critically read Saadi. Absolutely, we must read Proust. But in order to learn stream of consciousness, we can read Nizami. We must absolutely read Shakespeare. But Bahram Beyzai draws from within the Iranian tradition, a theatrical tradition that is brilliant and as much global as it is local. Golestan says, everyone tells me I took my prose from Hemingway. Hemingway, he says, I was a student of Saadi. I learned from Saadi. I even learned some of my cinematic tricks. I learned at the jump cut from Saadi. We quote him in the book. The book is actually dedicated to him. We quote him in the book. He says, this is where Saadi teaches me the jump cut. Let me end by pointing to another remarkable aspect of Saadi's humanism. It has been said that one of the most remarkably succinct encapsulation of humanism is the ceiling in Sistine Chapel, the creation of Adam, the moment where God's hand is about to meet Adam. Some critics have said, this is really not the biblical story. Although it's in Sistine Chapel, this ain't the biblical story. God exists and humans exist in fully formed bodies. In other words, some have gone further and said where God sits on top has the look of a brain, and Michelangelo was trying to say that the creation of man is God. Man is not the creation of man, God, but God is the creation of man. In other words, he was saying, Michelangelo was saying, what German philosophers Feuerbach and Hegel and Marx said in the 19th century, that religion is a fetishism of the human mind. Whether you accept it as fetishism or not, the point is that it questions that story and posits something remarkable. It posits the idea that humans were there at the moment of creation. Saadi virtually says the same thing several times. Not only Saadi says it, Hafez says it too. Hafez literally has the poet, Saadi has himself watching these moments of creation. That's why he says, what I learned from human beings. In other words, even the moment of creation, he was there to watch. He is there to help us think. The traditionalists tell us that Saadi is a sermonizer. Saadi is a remarkable manifestation of what Bakhtin calls dialogical thinking. Thinking based on dialogue, thinking based on common search for an ever-changing reality. For that, we think he not only is a great humanist in the Iranian tradition, but I think a giant in world literature. And we quote many people who have in the past compared him favorably to Shakespeare. We too think that he deserves the kind of a praise and the kind of a scrutiny and the kind of a criticism that someone as important as Shakespeare deserves. And unfortunately, those two tendencies that I have told you about have not allowed much in-depth scrutinizing and writing and thinking about Saadi. We still don't have a single credible biography of Saadi. We have very little when you compare to the library of Shakespearean writers and compare it to the meagerness of what has been written about Saadi. You find what is truly tragic. And hopefully, the wonderful news in Iran is that this book has come at the time where there is a Saadi renaissance. People are reading Saadi more than ever. People are reading it with their own mind, not with the mind of the Western intellectuals who said Saadi is a reactionary, or the clerical interpretation that said Saadi is a sermonizer, Saadi is a religious dogmatist. They're reading it with their own mind, and that is the rebirth of humanism. Thank you very much. I've gone 5 minutes longer than what Ms. Parhat told me I should go, so I stop.
Thank you. That was wonderful. We have a few questions coming in. A few people have asked, what inspired you to write about Saadi? What particularly inspired you to turn your paper into a book?
I must be clear. I didn't turn my paper into a book. I wrote that paper, and I wrote the paper I wrote was actually a very close critical reading of chapter 1 of Golistan. Chapter 1 of Golistan is about monarchy, and I read it and essentially claimed, whether I've proven it or not, the readers have to judge. I claimed that virtually everything they have said about Saadi's politics is wrong. Saadi wasn't a eulogizer of kings. In fact, he eulogized them, but he criticized them very, very subtly. Saadi, more often than once, maybe 50 times I have counted, tells us about 50 times that I can't tell you everything I need to tell you. You need to read between the lines. I live in dark times. I live in times where the power political or the power clerical kill people for saying bad things. So he's leaving it to us to look to what T.S. Eliot calls the word within the word. And once you begin to read the word within the word of that first chapter, it's a remarkable story, different than anything else has been told. I read it and found that there isn't a single Persian king after the advent of Islam in Iran that Saadi does not think was a brute. Every king that he praises in that chapter is a king that belonged to ancient pre-Islamic Iran, where the notion of Dawd, justice, was central to the tenets of rulership. Not all the rulers followed that, but it was an accepted. And Saadi clearly knew the Zoroastrian past of Iran, played with it, understood it, took from Shahnameh to many others who have tapped into that history. So that was my take on chapter 1 of Golistan. After that, I always knew that one needs to read more. And I love his prose, I love his poetry, and I always was looking for an excuse to spend a fair amount of rigorous time just reading him and reading everything that has been written about him. And about 3 years ago, I decided when my colleague said, this discussion that we had could be the beginning of a discussion about a book. And I thought that is the beginning of something. And it is, I must also say that I truly believe that this book is only the beginning. Saadi needs to be studied, in my view, with the same type of rigor and the same type of multiplicities of views. I can absolutely believe that someone would read this stuff and come away with a very, very different interpretation. I hope they do, and I hope they criticize our take, and from that, a dialogue will be created and more people will go read it. I'm convinced when people go read it, they will be as amazed by his brilliance as we have been, and I continue to be.
Thank you. A few people are asking when the book might be available in English, and then also what your experience was like publishing the book inside Iran, and if there are concerns about it being censored.
I'm very much considering undertaking the translation. I say I, although my colleague has agreed that it would be wonderful to translate it. I would have to do it because I am the only English speaker in this team of authorship. I'm very keen on trying to do it. So I'm hoping that maybe in the next few months, I will try to get it done. Corona might help when you're in place, you don't go into traffic. In terms of publishing in Iran, some of you might know, I have several books that have in the past gotten permission and have been published. A book on Hoveyda, my book on modernity, my translation of Master and Margarita. These have been in print in Iran virtually for the last 25, 30 years. They've been constantly in print, but because they had an earlier permission. My book on the Shah was not permitted to be published, and thus I put it on social media and made it available for free download inside Iran. And fortunately, it has been read by many, many, many people. On this one, we decided that we're going to write it, and we're not going to hold too many punches, and we're going to see whether it can get published. Our agreement with the publisher was that you submit this text. If they accept it in total, we'll publish it. If not, we'll purchase the typeset from you and publish it outside, the way I published the book on the Shah outside. A very dear friend of mine in Canada made that possible. Someone who wasn't in publishing at all, but decided as an act of true, essentially philanthropy, I think, started the publishing house and made Negahi Bashah a book. And then he also published another book from Professor Farzaneh Milani on Furuq Farrokhzad that couldn't get published inside Iran. And we were ready if it doesn't get the permission. But they didn't ask us to cut anything. There are, if you read the book in Persian, I think you will be as surprised that it did get, as happy that it did get permission. I'm not sure what will happen to the second printing. The first printing is, I'm told, finished. And whether it will get to a second printing inside remains to be seen. But as soon as it doesn't inside Iran, we'll absolutely publish it outside Iran and put it on the way we put the Negahi Bashah for people to read inside Iran.
Thank you. A few questions along this vein of how you would compare Hafez and Saadi and their influence on Iranian culture.
I don't want to make facile comparisons. I am not an expert on Hafez. I am an avid reader of Hafez, and I leave that to other critics who might make this comparison. But as an avid reader of Hafez and an avid reader of Saadi, or more serious reader of Saadi, as someone who studied Saadi much, much more carefully and closely than Hafez. I actually started writing something about Hafez 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and I had a wonderful research assistant who was a graduate student at Stanford, a brilliant, brilliant young man. And he was helping do some of the kind of things that I was trying to do at the time. But then I got interested in Saadi because I thought Saadi has a much more complex view of the world, is much, much more versatile in his genres. Hafez has only written ghazals. They're brilliant, they're stunning, they're miraculous. They're almost impossible to translate because of the complexity of the language, the multiplicity of layers of meaning that exist in that language. But that's also true, I think, in Saadi. Saadi is very difficult to translate in that sense. So I think they're different. I think Saadi is much more of the multi-genre, multi-talented, modern view. Hafiz was very averse to traveling. Hafiz essentially stayed in the same place and wrote these brilliant love poems that were also critical of clergy and also very praiseful of wine. I think somebody should one day write a book. Some people have tried, but it hasn't been comprehensive about how significant both of these themes are. The theme of criticizing piously appearing critics who, as Hafiz famously said, they say one thing in public and they do something entirely different when they go in private. Saadi is very critical of that. Hafiz is very critical of that. And both of them have taken something from Khayyam, who says, we all die, life is passing, and thus things that can save us are creativity, our love, and our wine. Those are three things that I think they both share as the only efficient solace to the pain they feel about life, the anxiety about death, the anxiety about the complexities that cannot be understood.
Thank you. A viewer is asking, how could Saadi be a humanist when in his poetry he sees those people different from himself as not worthy of a living?
Well, as I told you, I'm sure somebody can find one line that contradicts the humanist story. In the chapter, the first chapter of the book, we talk about our methodology. And we say, when somebody has written as much as Saadi has, and this is also true about, as I said, I keep comparing it to Shakespeare because I think it's a very apt comparison. This is also true about Shakespeare. Was Shakespeare a misogynist? Was Shakespeare a Catholic? Was Shakespeare a Protestant? Was Shakespeare an atheist? Was Shakespeare a conformist or a revolutionary? Stephen Greenblatt has written brilliantly about Shakespeare and basically says it's very difficult. It depends on how you look. It depends when you look. It depends what plays you look. Shakespeare wrote The Taming of the Shrew, which could be considered very profoundly misogynist. But he also has 8 or 9 plays that he has written named after women. Some of the most remarkable characters in theater are Shakespearean women characters. The same is true about Saadi. I'm sure there is a passage where he talks about there's several passages, several poems lines of poems that you could construe exactly as the kind of nasty, smart, self-assured point of view of a cultural hegemon. But what we say in our methodological chapter is that we follow what Jacobson, a literary critic, talks about as the dominant in every text, particularly a text that is so complicated and so vast as Saadi is. There are multiplicities of views, but there is also something that seems to be the more dominant thing. I think those lines are there. They should be criticized. I told you there are lines where they badly stink of anti-Semitism. But there are also lines where he tells a Muslim, who the hell are you to tell a Jew that you're better than him, or a Christian, or an Hindu? So in the reading of the person who has asked that question, obviously those other lines and those other many, many, many stories in Gulistan are not the true Saadi. One of the things, again, we have tried to do is we argue, following many tradition of literary critics, saying that not only Saadi keeps telling us that don't listen to the surface. I have to hide this. You know, Borges famously said, censorship is the mother of metaphors. Saadi keeps telling us, hey, Reader, I'm speaking in metaphors. There's somebody standing at the top of my head, might chop my head off. He literally says this. So it's for us to look for the word within the word. But when you look for the word within the word, you might go wrong. You might be attributing something to him that is your wish. And only through criticism, the criticism of this person who has kindly asked the question, criticism of people who will write the review of this book, our criticism of others who have seen Saadi in different ways, can we begin to arrive at a better understanding. We can't ever arrive at the true understanding. Even if you ask Saadi what the true meaning of his life work is, we actually make this argument following many literary critics, that oftentimes if you ask writers what their book is about, they almost always sound more stupid than the book. The book has a life and intelligence far greater. Any good book, sometimes books are unfortunately much less smart than their authors, but great books almost invariably are smarter than their writer. Saadi talks about things that we think, for example, have elements of psychology in it, elements of 19th century philosophy in it. If you ask Saadi, do you know Hegel? He said, who the hell is Hegel? Does that mean that reading that we have isn't there? No, Saadi doesn't know it. So again, to compare it to Shakespeare, for 400 years, people performed Hamlet. Nobody thought Hamlet's problem is that he's an Oedipal complex, till Freud comes around. And it completely changes the way. So only out of an evolving and conflicting and dialogically changing interpretations can we arrive at approximations, and then future generations will change. You know, every generation, every age has a different reading of the classics. What we understand from Shahnameh today is very different than what they understood about Shahnameh 150 years ago. Today, everybody's, not everybody, a lot of people are reading about the letter of Rostam to his brother, talking about these Arabs who have come to destroy an earlier age that wasn't facing a theocracy would read different parts of Shahnameh. Same with Saadi, I think.
Thank you. Why is Saadi not well known in the Western world, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, as I said, at one time he was, but Saadi is not well known in the Western world because I think the responsibility is primarily on Iranian writers, scholars, and intellectuals. We have failed to represent the Iranian culture the way it needs to be represented. Many of us have felt that there isn't much there to represent. Some of us have gone hyperbolic and saying, quoting Shahnameh, that all that is beautiful comes from Iran. Hunar nazd Iraniyan ast o bas. No, Hunar is not only in Iran, but a hell of a lot of brilliant Hunar and architecture and carpet and writing and poetry and philosophy has come from Iran. And we have failed, we being the Iranian people Iranian intellectuals, Iranian historians, Iranian scholars, we haven't done a good enough job. We haven't yet written, as I said, a biography of Saadi. I know it's difficult because every bastard who has come to Shiraz and dominated Shiraz destroyed half of the libraries. The other one destroyed the papers. It's very difficult to get at some of these things. But there is a lot of stuff in our libraries that we haven't yet gotten to. And our inability to, or our unwillingness to do the work has left some of these people, I think, stranded. Although, as I said, in the 19th century, Saadi was a very famous poet. Emerson knew about him and wanted to learn Persian. Goethe wrote a whole Eastern Divan inspired by Saadi and Hafiz. The president of France in late 19th century was named after Saadi. A great physicist was named Saadi. Literally, a French scholar was called Saadi something. A president was, that's how household name he was. Now it has become obscure because many of the people at that time who were interested in Saadi were looking at Saadi for an exotic Oriental spiritual. I still read how Saadi, many of these people who write about Saadi, this mystic, this Oriental, they took in late 19th century, they took one of the most brilliant, one of the most iconoclastic poets of Iranian history, Khayyam, and turned him into a Sufi in the hands of somebody who made the translation, made a great translation, but left very little of Khayyam. And we have done very little in introducing these people and finding a language. I mean, part of it is because we haven't really done enough work, but part of it is also because of the complexity of the poetic language. I mean, Hafiz is very difficult to translate. Saadi is very difficult. Saadi is easier than Hafiz, but it is remarkable the echoes that he uses, some of the plays that he has between meanings and sounds and layers and underlayers and context. It is very, very, very difficult to translate. The same way it's very difficult to translate Shakespeare into Persian.
Thank you. Well, we still have many more questions, and unfortunately we're running out of time. But everyone, I hope will stay tuned for when we announce the Farsi version of the talk, and maybe we can pick up some of the questions there. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Professor Milani, for the talk, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you for inviting me.
Good night, everyone.